Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Law of the Empire podcast, a podcast where we make all things legal fun and relatable as well as easy to understand. I'm Reina and I'm your host. On today's episode, we will be interviewing Ally Potamianos. Ally is a JSD student from Canada. She's recently graduated from NYU's LLM program and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto and a JD from Osgoode Hall Law School. She's super educated. Prior to coming to NYU, Ally worked as a municipal lawyer in Toronto, Canada. She's interested in urban governance and homelessness issues. So, right now, Ally's research is a doctoral project which will focus on comparing the regulation of homeless encampments on public property in North American cities. On today's episode, Ally will tell us a bit about what urban governance really is and just also help inform us on homelessness issues. She will also tell us a bit about how high schoolers can get more involved in public policy and tips to succeed in law school, as well as good book recommendations and good podcast recommendations for people who are interested in public policy and homelessness issues. So without further ado, here's Ally.
So I'm Ally. I am a first year doctoral student at NYU Law. And I am currently researching the regulation of homelessness and homeless encampments in American cities. No, I'm actually in the doctoral program. And I did the LLM, which is the master's program last year.
So, like, what was your favorite part about the about studying at NYU's LLM program when you did it last year?
My favorite part about studying at NYU was really getting to know the faculty members. Um, they really make themselves available to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my experience of it. And I also really liked the variety of classes. So I took an environmental law class. And then I also took a class about environmental and energy law, and I had never learned anything about energy law before. So yeah, I found the people and also the variety of classes there to make the experience really great.
That's great. So, how did your experiences at the University of Toronto and Osgoode Hall Law School prepare you for your current research?
So I think that my experiences at the University of Toronto first prepared me for my research, because I did my undergrad degree was in urban planning and geography, and more than just learning like the subject matter, and the sort of like history of urban planning as a profession, I really learned how to think critically about current events and what I was sort of
Mm-hmm.
seeing in the news. And I've always been really interested in housing issues specifically. And that
Mm-hmm.
was something that was really at the forefront of some of the classes that I took at the University of Toronto. And I actually went to law school with the idea of wanting to become a land use planning lawyer. So when I was at Osgoode, I took an environmental justice clinic, and I was interested in the clinic because it took a broader sort of perspective to environmental law issues, thinking about housing justice and transportation justice, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I was working with a professor through the clinic, that was doing work on human rights and homeless encampments. So that's sort of where that interest came. And through that experience, I kind of developed, not just an interest, but also I think some expertise in the legal issues around homeless encampments.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you think North American cities can better balance the rights of homeless individuals with public space regulations?
Yeah, so this is a tough question, and I think it's one that governments and even courts are having a hard time grappling with. I think the biggest thing that I would say should be considered is perhaps that the people on either side of that sort of like balancing equation um come are sort of differently situated. So people who are sheltering in parks versus people who have homes and um are uh able to use other spaces, like sort of what's the how do we how can we sort of like center the vulnerability of those who don't have homes,
Mm-hmm.
um, rather than like mainly focusing or only focusing on your constituents who do have homes and who are able to sort of gather resources, both financial and also just like time resources, to make their voices heard. So I guess what I would say is that, local governments, I think, and all governments need to think about the position of each, um, I guess, parties of the interests that they're balancing,
Mm-hmm.
and think through whether they're actually, start equal or starting on the same playing field.
Yeah, totally. So, what differences or similarities have you observed in how cities handle homeless encampments?
So I would say that in terms of similarities, there has been a big push toward criminalization of
Mm-hmm.
homelessness and homeless encampments in cities. And I don't necessarily think that's a new phenomenon. However, there is some data that's come out of the National Homelessness Law Center showing that since the Supreme Court of the United States decision in Grants Pass that was just handed down this summer, which basically enabled um, municipalities to criminalize sleeping in public. Um, there's some research showing that since that decision, uh, municipal laws criminalizing homelessness have increased. So I think the trend in terms of similarities is that more and more cities are turning to the criminal law to deal with um, a rising trend in homelessness. And in terms of differences, I guess one difference would be sort of like the scale of the problem in each city. So you see more movement on encampments in on the West Coast, where there are a lot more encampments,
Mm-hmm.
visible encampments than in New York City, for example, um, where there's a right to shelter. So I guess I would say that there's not so much difference that I've seen in terms of approach. Um, some cities may be more compassionate than others, but I haven't seen anything that's sort of like really stand out in that way.
Okay, so like, were there any like other serious repercussions from the Supreme Court case you were just discussing?
Um, well, I think there are a couple of repercussions of that decision. Not only does it enable municipalities to criminalize sleeping in public without constitutional restriction, I think some of the language in the decision stigmatizes unhoused people further. So, just as one example, the court in its decision makes this distinction between involuntary and voluntary homelessness, sort of creating this distinction between people who are choosing to live outside and demonizing them for that versus people who are voluntarily homeless and really have nowhere else to go, whatever that might mean. The court doesn't really tell us. So I think it just sort of adds to already the sort of stigmatization of unhoused people, um, and legitimizes it in some ways because it's coming from
Mhm.
the highest court in the country.
Yeah. So, are there any cities in North America that you think are they doing a particularly good job addressing homelessness, or are they like all around like the same approach to it?
Um, I don't know that I can answer that question with a uh general. I don't know that I can answer that question really with any authority.
Okay.
I think that my intuition is that most of it is the same. You see like red and blue cities taking similar-ish approaches.
Hmm.
But that's just sort of my intuition based on things I've been
Okay.
following and not necessarily a fact.
Yeah, okay, totally. Like, what advice would you give to high school students interested in pursuing a career in law or urban governance?
Um, so the advice I would give to high school students, um, is really to seek out areas, um, of law or politics that are of interest to you and really follow those issues and don't lose sight of those things when um, if you decide to go to law school or some other um, professional school. I think it's kind of easy to forget what things you really care about when you're in those settings, sorry. And one thing that I've always really known is that um, I want to do justice-oriented work, and I've tried to keep that at the top of mind whenever I'm thinking about sort of like um next steps. So yeah, following all different kinds of news sources, reading a lot, and keeping up with your own interests.
You got any recommendations for like readings or like news sources to follow based on like the interest of law or urban governance?
Um, hmm, that's a good question. I have to think about that. In terms of reading, Um, in terms of reading for news, things that I follow because I am currently in New York City,
Hmm.
are news sites like City Limits and Gothamist. They're sort of like more local news sources that I like to turn to. Um, and then in terms of like longer um works or books. I'm trying to think. I think The Color of Law is a good book by I cannot remember the person's first name, but his last name is Rothstein.
Okay, got it.
Which is a book about the history of redlining and racial segregation in the United States and how that's like shaped American cities.
Hmm.
I think that's actually a really good book, which sort of covers the intersection of both law and urban governance.
Okay, that's so helpful. Thank you. Could you like describe your process from like college to like where you are now with your education, all the steps it took you to get here, maybe?
Sure. Um, so I went straight from college to law school. And like I said earlier, I thought I wanted to be a land use planning lawyer. And so that's kind of why I went to law school. Um, but I kind of discovered while I was there that I really liked sort of researching and writing and thinking about legal issues in a more academic way. And so when I was in law school, I published a paper for my class that I really liked writing, which was about um, evidence, how Indigenous oral history evidence can be used in the courtroom. Um, and I had a really positive experience like working on that article and publishing it. So I kind of had in the back of my mind that I wanted to be a legal academic and teach
Mm-hmm.
and research and write. Um, but I kind of thought that I should try being a lawyer before I made that decision. So after law school, I did practice law for 2 years with a municipal government where I learned a lot about how municipal governments work and was able to like again follow issues that I thought were interesting, political issues, governance issues. But ultimately, I knew that I wanted to do my own research and writing about these issues that I really cared about. So then I decided after 2 years to apply for the Masters of Law, the LLM program at NYU.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I liked it so much that I stayed here for my doctorate. And yeah, again, I'm sort of like working on publishing some more of my papers about local government issues and yeah, getting the the opportunity to think and write about things that I care about and kind of be my own boss in that way has been
Mm-hmm.
amazing. I'm very grateful to be able to do that.
Yeah, totally. Like that sounds great. So, what skills do you think are most important for success in law school and as a lawyer?
So I guess for law school, um, there's all the kind of like classic things in terms of like being a good student, paying attention in class,
Mm-hmm.
um, doing reading, asking questions when you need help, both of professors and classmates. But I think one of the more important things that I didn't learn until later in law school, um, is sort of taking time for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Law school can be a kind of competitive place. Um, and it's easy to sort of get caught up in only doing a bunch of studying and work. But it's also important to like not be doing that kind of stuff all the time for
Mm-hmm.
your mental health. And um, I found that when I started, doing taking better care of myself outside of school, I was able to show up to school better as well. And
Yeah.
perhaps that applies maybe not just in law school, but in high school and college and all
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
those.
Totally.
And then in terms of being a successful lawyer, I think the same things, attention to detail, um, uh, being responsive to people, showing up every day with uh, a good attitude are all things that I think um, are traits of lawyers.
Mm-hmm. And how can young people get involved in addressing homelessness issues in their communities?
I think that one way people can get involved in really any issue is to find out what's going on in your community about
Mm-hmm.
this issue, maybe about homelessness or any other issue. Like, what is your council member doing? What's happening in your city generally? Can you reach out to your council member's office for more information to express your opinion? Are there um, volunteer opportunities, working with various people, and on other issues. So I think there's lots of ways that you can sort of start small by just
Yeah.
learning about what's happening just within your community. Sometimes these issues feel really big, and thinking about what's going on just outside can
Hmm.
be a tangible way to sort of like move forward and try to help in any way that you can.
Yeah, that's like such helpful advice. So what do you hope to achieve with your research in the long term? Because like obviously you've done a lot to this point. Like what like big overall future goals you have maybe that you hope to
Yeah,
achieve?
yeah, I guess my future goals, in terms of just like my general, like my career, I want to teach other students and again do my own um, research. I think that part of what I am trying to do in some of my work is to think about the way that law is used to harm people and to stigmatize people, specifically unhoused people, and to sort of like shed light on that and um, push against that sort of narrative,
Hmm.
um, because it kind of, comes up all the time, and judges have power, and that shouldn't be taken lightly, including in what they write in their judgments.
Yeah, totally. Okay, that's my last question. So thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much for
much.
all your time. This was
No,
so
thank you.
helpful for everyone, I'm sure.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and for reaching
Yeah, of
out.
course. Of course. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for listening to this week's episode of Law of the Empire. I know I learned a lot from Ally in this week's episode, and I know I learned a lot about urban governance and homeless encampments in the US. She was also super helpful in telling us tips about how to succeed in high school and also what to do if we want to pursue a career in law or public policy. Again, thank you so much to Ally, and thank you all for listening to this week's episode. There are new episodes every other Wednesday, so tune in. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, don't forget to follow on Spotify and also follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Law of the Empire. I'll see you guys next Wednesday at 5 a.m. CST. Bye!